We are back with another episode of the NOH podcast, and I'm super excited to be joined by Mr. Thomas Cook. He is the Executive Director of the Ability Network of Delaware. So I'm going to let him introduce himself, and then we'll start on our topic today of advocacy.
Yeah, well, thanks, Casey. I have been working in Delaware now since 2014 as the director of an association of disability service providers, as well as organizations that serve people with behavioral health needs. And we also do some employment programs. And, we are a lobbyist. We lobby on behalf of our members. And, we also, try to make sure people have job opportunities.
That's great. I love that. So how did you get into this advocacy position? Now, first, let's back up and talk about exactly what advocacy is. So in your words, define what advocacy is in general for the human services field.
So advocacy really involves the sustained interaction with policymakers to try to produce a change that relates to funding, regulations, or anything that involves how human services works. And in our case, a lot of what we do is to try to make sure that rules and regulations promote what they're intended to do, and that funding is appropriate for the services that are being provided. And that can involve any number of things. I mean, it can involve getting grassroots activists engaged in dialogue with policymakers, lawmakers. It can also involve people writing letters to the editor. Could involve, people providing testimony at hearings. Any number of things that can communicate what your desired goal is, and the way you go about it is really about what advocacy is all about.
So you mentioned activist, and I want to also touch on the difference between what an advocate is and what an activist is, because I know some people get those confused, and it's understandable. So define or kind of differentiate what the two roles are.
So advocates really are any group that really is going forward with a position and trying to communicate it. An activist is somebody who's a little more committed, I think. So you could advocate at any point by writing a letter or, talking to a legislator. I mean, all that's about advocacy. It could involve any number of things. An activist is somebody who really sustains that advocacy over time and really is extremely committed to that cause.
Would you say activists more or less focus on like the public relations or the interaction with certain communities about specific, social issues and concerns, or do you feel kind of both roles have that?
Yeah, I think an activist has a deeper commitment. And so I think that the activist is really focused usually on a specific issue over time. Whereas, anybody can advocate like I said before, by just, you could have a street that's not being repaired and you call your city council office. Well, that's advocacy because you're trying to get something changed, right? An activist is somebody who takes on a cause and runs with it over time. So, I mean, that could be somebody who really believes in mental health, for example, that has had a family tragedy. I myself have had a family tragedy. And, I became committed to advocating for appropriate mental health services for people as a result of my son passing away due to suicide in 2007. That actually changed the focus of my career, because I went from being a consultant to state and local governments, as well as nonprofit agencies, and went right into a role where I was directing a children's mental health service, because I felt like I needed to give back at that point after my son had left us. And so, that motivated me to get involved in the positions I've had since 2007. After I left the nonprofit, I took a position in Wisconsin as an association director, partly because the groups that I was representing there actually did mental health services as well as what they do here. In fact, in Delaware, I represent more of those organizations.
I just want to point out something I'm sure you agree with, that I've seen as a pattern in just the last 3 episodes is we all have this personal story that brings us into the role that we have as service providers, right? And I think that's so important. We can touch on that in a different episode. I just wanted to highlight that so far, all of our guests have, and I'm sure going forward too, there's something that we experience that brings us into the service that we provide. Not always. I don't want to assume that about everyone, because there's so much interdisciplinary interaction. But I appreciate you sharing that, and defining the difference between an activist and an advocate. I never thought of it that way. I think that's kind of perfect. And it also invites anyone to go and advocate for something that they support, believe in, the change that needs to be made. So I'm curious about how you've had a lot of experience. Where did it start? And just in general, the process of growing into being an advocate. So your first position, and then kind of the opportunities that kept you going, kept you moving through your career.
I found out about a job at a place called Opportunity Center in Moline, Illinois, and it was kind of random. As a matter of fact, I had run into my uh, counselor from the community college I attended, and he wondered what I was doing. And I said, well, I was going to go to school in the fall, and I was looking for some employment. And so he said, well, I've got this job at the post office. And so I went and I visited with him, and he said, well, that job's gone, but I've got this other position. This was 1972. And he gave me a referral to a place called Opportunity Center. I went and met with the director of the program, a guy named Ron Weiscarver. And he was a Lutheran minister and had a commitment to social action. So he was an activist. And he got me excited about being in the field because he was taking all this new information that was coming out of Omaha, Nebraska, where a guy named Wolf Wolfensberger had developed all kinds of theories around how people with developmental disabilities should be treated in society. And his principle was called, the principle that Wolf Wolfensberger developed was called normalization. And normalization was all about helping people with disabilities get out of institutions and into community life. And in fact, what was important about that is that he believed that if you offered somebody normal patterns of living, so they got up in the morning and they went out to work like anybody else, they came home, they lived in a regular place, an apartment or a home in a regular neighborhood instead of in some building out in the country somewhere, which is what most of institutions actually developed into, were these huge, you know, remote places where you didn't have any interaction with the community at all. And in fact, I got to see some of those places, and it didn't really occur to me that I was going to get into that field because the very first opportunity I had to see an institution was in a place called Southern Colony. And Southern Colony, which is now a developmental disability center that serves people, it's a state operated facility. It's in Union Grove, Wisconsin. And I was with a high school sociology class. And I went out and saw this place, and it was very interesting because it was clear that people were not being treated well. You had a group of people who were wandering around in a large kind of open day room. You had 2 staff members who were kind of off to the side, more or less watching them, but really not interacting with them, really not taking care of them. People were half dressed. People were incontinent. They were starved for human attention. And our group of high school students that went into this place kind of immediately kind of shrunk into a group where some of us were on the outside and a lot of people were on the inside because they didn't want to have contact with these people. But that was my first opportunity to see how an institution actually looked. And right about that same time was when a number of exposés were happening around the country. So there's this one in the Pennsylvania area that was done by Bill Baldini called Suffer the Little Children, that exposed conditions at Penhurst Hospital. Also, Geraldo Rivera did something very similar with Willowbrook Hospital. And these were large institutions where those conditions that I observed were actually documented by video crews who went in and took film of what was happening. And when the public saw how people were being treated, they were horrified. People didn't even know that those things were going on. But anyway, so I was very fortunate to get into a community program that was run by a local association. We used to call them Association for Retarded Citizens. Now, the R word isn't something we talk about, but now they're called the ARC, or ARCs, local ARCs. So I was working for a local ARC, and the whole function of what I was starting my career in had to do with working with a group of about, I think at any point in time, there were 8 to 10 people who had really significant support needs, and I would take them through their day. So these were mostly people who lived at home, and they had really significant issues, either with speech or with behavior, or a combination of a number of different things where they needed guidance. And I worked with them on different activities. I started in a work activity center. And so we did things like, for example, we did sub-assembly of parts for an elevator company in Moline. And that was something we would do for a month, and then we'd go on to another activity. So we would do ceramics, and I would help the individuals actually make things like Christmas trees that would be lighted up, which is like one of our best sellers. It would actually raise money for people that they would be paid for it. We also had some looms, and so we did some weaving of rugs and placemats and those kinds of things. And so these were opportunities that we made for people. And then what happened was, as I stayed with that organization, what happened was we started going more and more into the community. So we developed residences for people where people could live in an apartment building. They could leave home and sort of graduate into a living situation like any other adult. Or they would have a working situation. So we had an enclave in industry in a like a cardboard packaging company, where I was supervising a work crew, and we would have all these jobs that they would offer for us to do. People would get paid for them. We'd have to keep very careful track of their earnings and how much they produced. But at any rate, more and more things got moved into the community, and not these kind of little sheltered environments. So I was excited to be a part of that. And that's really where my passion has been ever since, is really trying to give those folks an opportunity to participate in community life, whether it's at work or where they live or how they recreate. Most of my career has been spent focused on that kind of activity.
So let's jump back to the beginning, because you started in 1972. Is that what you said? So you were at the peak of the disabilities rights movement, right?
Absolutely. So what started happening was, there was, in the 1960s, President Kennedy had some initiatives to try to help the federal government fund studies, and he started a presidential committee to look at how people were being served. And eventually, a number of things happened in the 1970s that were very important. Besides lawsuits to try to close places like Willowbrook and Pennhurst, what happened was a number of laws were passed. So, for example, prior to 1975 and the passage of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, kids with developmental disabilities and other disabilities were actually excluded from public schools. So one of the things that happened in the 1970s was all kids, no matter what their disability is, were guaranteed a right to a public education like anybody else. So that was really significant. Also during that time, a lot of institutions started downsizing. So, and I got involved in that movement because, we actually, in my career, as time went on and I finished my advanced degrees, I went out and I became sort of an expert in how to help people, move from an institutional setting to a different kind of setting, and the kind of behavior supports that might be needed for somebody who's lived in an institution all their life as an adult. They would need a lot of support around, making sure that they understood what community life was all about and how they should be interacting with other people, the kinds of things that they couldn't do. And we had different methods of helping people understand those things, behavior change kinds of programs. So that was happening too during that time. So there was a lot of change in our field. So we went from this, system that had been developed over a couple of hundred years. It really took off in the late 1800s, went through the 1920s, where things started out kind of with a teaching mode in the 1800s, where there were some very famous people who came over from France and helped people in the United States kind of set up schools for people with disabilities. But eventually, what happened was they became large institutions that only provided basic custodial care, didn't have any kind of programmatic emphasis, didn't teach anybody anything, and really were neglectful and sometimes abusive towards those people. So that's what the exposés for Willowbrook and Pennhurst were all about, is to try to put some public pressure on making change in that situation. And then, the federal government stepped in and started funding some of these places as alternatives to these large state institutions. And that's where things really blossomed for people.
And in case anybody doesn't know about these institutions that he's speaking of, I'll put more information about them down in the description of this video. These were very, I would say, horrifying. I mean, the conditions at some of these institutions were just outright bad. Like you said, you described the experience that you had in the beginning when you went into, what institution was it that you visited?
It was in southern Wisconsin. It was called Southern Colony at the time, and now it's the Southern Wisconsin Center for Developmental Disabilities. So that place went from serving thousands of people down to just a few, a handful of people. And most people who are living out in the community now, based on what happened in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, to help people, have opportunities outside of these large institutions to live in the community.
So we know there are plenty of activists in that time with all sorts of topics, but Judith Herman, right, was one of kind of the leader activists when it came to the disabilities rights movements. So with her in mind, and just kind of not everyone's, but the understanding that was a time in history where there was a lot of noise being made about certain human rights issues, where do you feel like advocacy fit into that? Or do you think that it was just kind of a time for the issues to be brought about before the role of the advocates came in?
Well, it was really people with physical disabilities who started speaking up for their options to live in the community as well, because a lot of people with physical disabilities were confined to nursing homes where they really shouldn't have been living. It was a mismatch. People who were younger, maybe in their 20s or 30s, who had a physical disability, needed some assistance during the day and at night. And they could be living in their own if somebody would come in and provide that. But there was no system to actually deliver those services. And so they began speaking out and really advocating for personal assistance to help them in community living, whether it was at home or at work, to provide them with supports as they might need it. So that was a parallel movement to what I was working in for people with developmental disabilities. It was really, the ARCs and people who were supporting them nationwide did a really great job getting money into the system to help these folks. The people with physical disabilities really had to fight very, very hard, not just for the right to live in the community, but the right to access places in the community, which is sort of where the Americans with Disabilities Act came in. As it was being, adapted, and those groups were going to Washington and chaining themselves to doors and having protests and so forth. They were really focused on trying to get something done so that they would have access to public buildings. They would be able to go to the bathroom when they needed to in a restaurant. All the things that we all take for granted when we're able-bodied, because they had physical disabilities, were very difficult for them. So that's what we saw as a result of the Americans with Disabilities Act, a lot of the barriers to their participation in the community being removed. It's not unusual anymore for you to see when a politician is making a speech for, somebody to be doing sign language. Well, that's an accommodation that's helpful for people to participate in the political life of our country.
Right.
And those are the kinds of things that resulted from the Americans with Disabilities Act, which, by the way, had a significant impact in my field as well, because there was a decision that was written by Ruth Bader Ginsburg, which maybe isn't one of her more famous decisions, but it was tremendous in our field, because what it did was it took the civil rights that were granted to people with disabilities in the Americans with Disabilities Act and applied it to institutional settings. And essentially what it said was that people had the right to live in the community. People who were in an institution who wanted to live in the community had a right to leave that institution and have their services in the community instead.
Yeah, I
That,
guess
that
a
was
lot of
called
conjunctions.
that was called the Olmsted decision, because Tommy Olmsted was a commissioner of the social services in the state of Georgia, and it was two women who were suing him for the right to live in the community. And that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, when Justice Ginsburg actually decided the case and wrote a really stunning decision about the rights of people to live in the community.
I am a Georgia born and raised, and I did not know that. I'm really, really proud of that. I love that. So you brought up the legalities, right? So advocates work a lot with policy and lawmakers. Talk a little bit more about the interaction there. I know that people have heard, they know what lobbyists are. And so like there's this kind of mix of work together to have voices heard and then reflect that into policy making. What is that process like? Because I imagine it's quite difficult because it takes so long for policies to be written in the first place. And it, no matter what the change is, there has to be a loud enough demand for it, a loud enough call. So at what point, talk about the process and then how policymakers kind of make that turning point to say, okay, we're going to do something about this and write a new law or whatever and back this change. What does that look like?
Well, I can give you a pretty good example of that, because when I came to work here in Delaware in July of 2014, one of the big goals that the association that I currently direct had was to try to improve funding for services. So there was a system in place in Delaware that actually I worked within as a residential services provider. I was a regional director over a company that had services here in Delaware, and that's how I became interested and aware of what was happening here. And so I was in charge of supervising what happened in the state of Delaware, as well as Wisconsin, Illinois, and New Jersey. So it was kind of a strange region. I was actually based in Wisconsin, but I would fly out to the East Coast and meet with people and try to promote what we did, which was for a company whose mission was to respect the choices of people with developmental disabilities and really try to help them achieve what their choice was in terms of living arrangements, work, etc. So what happened then was we moved from a situation in which those services were being paid on what was called a cost reimbursement basis. So it's not too complicated, really. What it meant was every agency on an annual basis submitted a budget to the Division of Developmental Disability Services, and if it was approved, you had line item authority then to spend within the budget you were given for staff, for benefits, for program supplies, for food, whatever the category was. So that system was in place until 2004. In 2004, a rate system was developed actually by a company called William Mercer Government Consulting, and it was based on the principle that every hour of service should be a fully loaded rate. So they based it on the hourly wage of the person who is providing the service. So direct support professionals is what we call those people in our field in developmental disabilities, or actually in any number of different settings. But those direct support professionals, let's say they have a wage of $10 an hour. Well, then every other cost then would be expressed as a percentage of that on an hourly basis, so that you could build the services that somebody needed. You could say, hey, this person's going to need this many hours of service. and it would pay for everything related to that service, including payroll taxes and benefits, including program supervision and training, including general administrative supports. All that was built into the rate. So that rate system started in 2004, and the General Assembly in Delaware actually fully funded it at the outset. So the recommendations made by Mercer were for how much money it would take to do that, which was around $6 million at that time. They put that into the budget. So it was annualized. And the problem was from 2004 forward, by the time I got here in 2014, there wasn't a substantial increase. And what you need to do when you put a rate system like that in place is you need to rebase it every once in a while. You need to look at your assumptions. You need to think about whether or not that wage you originally set up is still competitive in the local labor market, whether insurance and other costs that you have to pay for people's health insurance has gone up, and so forth and so on. So it's really designed, a rebasing is designed to take another look at a rate and make sure it's still providing the outcomes that you want, which is to provide a quality service. Well, it wasn't. By 2014, what had happened just before I came into the state, they had a rate study, and the rate study showed that there was somewhere in the neighborhood of about $20 million shortfall in state funding. Now, all that funding is matched by federal funding under the Medicaid program. So it went from a $6 million fully funded situation over 10 years, because they didn't give any adjustments in that time, or very, very small adjustments. I don't think there was actually anything until 2014. It got behind, and the providers and people, families knew that there was a problem, because it was getting harder and harder to replace staff that left. So turnover increased, vacancy rates, staff vacancies began to increase, and all that had an impact on quality. And you could see it. A family member going into a home where their son or daughter lived might see a new staff member every time they went in. And they would have to start over again, explaining who they were, expectations they had for services, et cetera, et cetera. So there was a group that was called Families Speaking Up that was formed and started advocating for these changes. And we began consistently working with them, as well as with our members, to generate messages related to the need for additional funding. Now, what really made a difference, though, was when we had a legislative champion who we began working with and consistently talking with her. She was actually the chair of the budget writing committee, chair, co-chair, that, in Delaware that rotates. So every year you're either a co-chair or a chair. If you're the person that a House or the Senate caucus puts in place. So the party that's in power gets to either chair or co-chair that budget writing committee for their House or Senate. And what happened then was she began trusting us, so that we would provide her with information about what was happening, how it was affecting families. She cared very deeply about that, and others did too. But she was our champion. So she got tired of nothing happening, no money going into the budget. So at the very last minute in one of our sessions, and I think it was in 2017, she put forward a bill in June of that year. And that bill basically was designed to create a new study of what it would take to provide those services at the proper rate, and to fully fund it. Well, that bill didn't go anywhere. The next session, that bill didn't go anywhere. So the next year, and actually it was probably 2016, 2017, 2018 was the key year. So by that time, this Family Speaking Up group had rebranded and drew new members in. They began wearing these T-shirts that were green T-shirts. They had the name, the rebranded name, which was the A-Team of Delaware, that they began wearing to legislative meetings. So, legislators would see these people coming in their green T-shirts. It became very much identified as a parent group who was interested in this issue, making sure people got proper funding. The other thing that happened was when that bill then evolved for an update to the study that was published in 2014, it specified that there should be an update, and that based on that, that the General Assembly should fully fund services. That bill then became known as the Michael McNesby Full Funding for IDD Services Act, because a very well-known family in Delaware had a sibling who had Down syndrome, passed away in March 2018. There were 500 people at his funeral because he was so well known in the community. He was involved in all kinds of activities. People knew him and loved him, and he passed away, unfortunately. And it was one of the parents that came up with the idea, what if we name this bill after Michael? And it made all the difference, because then it generated knowledge and support that we were able to bring an identity to the bill based on somebody who many of the legislators knew, and the family that was known. And it generated a whole lot of support. We had support from Catholic Charities. We had support from all different kinds of people. And eventually the McNesby Act was passed unanimously by the House and the Senate and signed into law in September 2018, stating that there needed to be a new study, and that the legislature was committed to full funding of that, subject to available funding, of course. So it is the only law in the country, by the way, that specified that, based on a rate study, that there was a commitment to fully fund services for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
Just to clarify, it was originally written, the rate system was put into place in 2004 or 14?
2004.
So nothing changed from 2004 to 2018?
There were some real minor, like 1% increase, stuff like that. But what the 2014 study showed, there was about $20 million in state funding that we were short for full funding. The 2019 study, that when it was published, again 5 years later, 2019, that showed a $42 million shortfall.
Oh my gosh. And this is compared to, it's compared to cost of living and the labor, right? Like for service providers to come in. That's a really long time. Oh my goodness.
So there were different assumptions made. So the 2014 assumption was that direct support professionals should be paid $12.75 an hour. The 2019 study said $14 and $11. Well, we all know, that everybody's talking about a minimum wage of $15 an hour now. So over time, those wages are no longer competitive, which makes it harder to attract and retain people into the field. I mean, when I started, in 1972, I was paid minimum wage. It was a nonprofit. I was okay with that. I didn't have a family to support at the time. I was just looking for something to do and a job to earn some money. Well, over time, for me to stay in the field, I needed to be able to be paid a little more. I got more education, I got more experience. So with education and experience, I was able to request higher salaries, but I was no longer a direct support professional anymore. And, those folks are actually the most important people in our service field, because they interact with people. They are the ones who are teaching and supporting individuals day in and day out on the front line. And now, as a result of the pandemic, those people are essential. Without them, many more people would have died. And we've done a really great job keeping people safe in Delaware. We've had some deaths, unfortunately, but, we've kept our, COVID incidents very low in our group home and supported apartment population. And, we had to close down virtually all of our day programs in the state a year ago in March. So it's been exactly 1 year ago that they all closed down. And so the people who were going out of their family homes and going out of their group homes and supported apartments to do something during the day, that normal pattern of living, that went away. Everybody was confined to their homes, and staff would be coming in. The staff had to be very, very careful protecting themselves to be able to protect the people they were supporting. So when you look at the number of people who actually contracted COVID, whether it was people with disabilities living in those homes or the staff members, it's relatively low in Delaware compared to some of the other states that were sort of right on the very beginning of the pandemic and before they even knew what was happening or how to protect people. So these are essential workers. These are people who make life and death decisions, and to pay them less than $15 an hour doesn't make a lot of sense. And in fact, when we look at the competition in our labor market here, it's not unusual for Costco, for example, or another retail outlet, Amazon, to be paying $15, $16 an hour. And yet, the starting wages for most of the residential workers in Delaware are somewhere down around 12 and 13 an hour.
You make a fine point about the essential worker category. Immediately people think of doctors, nurses, and they're right. But again, these are service providers that are going in and making life and death decisions. And when it comes down to the labor market, like you said, I don't know why there's this disconnect that a doctor should be making so much more than a service provider. Both are working hands-on in the front lines and are responsible in the supporting and even saving another human being's life. But in the human services, and not all positions, but especially the ground workers, it's like, here's a basket of eggs and like some bread for what you've done. I mean, meanwhile, so many other people that have equally as hard or responsible positions are paid bukus. And I don't understand, we talked about this in the last episode. We often get paid in like empathy and support and like do good spirit. It's like, that doesn't keep the lights on, our bellies full, our families supported. I can't, it doesn't make any sense, but that's why we have these conversations, right?
Well, and we know what it taught for a single person to rent an apartment, a 1-bedroom apartment, even a without a bedroom, it takes about $18 an hour. That's what you would have to make. So people who work in our field have to usually work 2 jobs. A direct support professional can't make it on 40 hours a week. They either have to rack up a lot of overtime, which is available, unfortunately, a lot of times, and it burns people out, or they have to work 2 jobs. Either way, we had somebody who was giving testimony at a budget hearing a couple weeks ago, and she said, I have to work 2 jobs just to be destitute. And, that really struck home. I mean, so when we're advocating for the folks to make an appropriate wage to the difficulty of the work they have to do, we are looking at, really trying to help people who want to be in this field, who want to do this work, but oftentimes can't stay in the field because they're paid so poorly.
Yes, absolutely. I've seen that before, where there's, people have the passion to be in the positions that they have, but it just doesn't meet their needs to survive. And that is not a thought. That's not even a thought that we talked about in my studies, right? Because I don't know, maybe you know better. That's not a conversation that often goes on in the discipline or outside of it. How are people that are providing these services surviving themselves if their work, the level of work and responsibility they have, doesn't match the compensation that they're getting, right? And you've mentioned a couple times throughout this talk, kind of like the process includes, starting at like the ground level. So a lot of what you've said are people in the community who have come together with the same passion, motivation, and mission, kind of started in local legislation. They made their voices heard. They persevered, because we can all at this point realize that it takes a long time not super long, but there's this lengthy amount of time for changes to be made because, like you said, there was the budget, the lady who worked in the budget position, she had a passion for it. And if it had been anyone else who could have cared less, like their voices might have not been heard. I really, I'm moved by the fact that that bill was passed because there was this personal connection made. So if people were empathetic, they knew on a personal level how the community like interacted with, what was his name, Michael?
Yeah, Michael McNesby. And so, what's really cool about it is that there are these fundraising activities that the Down Syndrome Association does, and Michael was famous because he would lead his group would lead the walks that they would do where they would raise money. He would get up at the bandstand in Rehoboth Beach. He'd get up in the microphone and he would sing "My Way," and it was great. I mean, and there are pictures of him doing this, and I don't know if I've seen any video of him, but that same year when the National Down Syndrome Association was promoting fundraising activities, the same year that the Michael McNesby Act passed in Delaware, Michael's picture was shown on the screen at Times Square. And we have photos of Michael at Times Square after he passed away. But he made just his family's commitment was terrific because they said, yes, of course, we want to help other people. And if naming this bill after him gives it a better chance, we're all for it. And so just having that kind of identity, being able to connect with people, we had pictures of Michael with one of his staff members from Elwyn, where he went to his day program. We did postcards with their pictures with their picture on the postcards, asking people to support the bill. We have a website, mcnesbyact.com. You can go look at it. His picture's there. But there are, a number of things that it just opened the door, having the publicity associated with that. We did have a public relations firm. We did have a lobbying firm, but what really made the difference was those family members, those grassroots advocates who went to Legislative Hall, which is the state capitol in Delaware, and talked with their representatives and their senators about how important it was to them that these services be properly funded, that the direct support professionals get the money they needed to be able to stay on the job instead of having to go look for a better job elsewhere. So it's just an example of how when the right set of circumstances is put together, you have people working all on the same team to get something done. It can make a tremendous difference. And we got, by the way, over 2 years, we got $9 million in state funding. So, that money is matched by so every dollar right now, actually because of the pandemic, but there's an overmatch in Delaware. So right now, every dollar of state spending is actually matched by $1.77 in federal spending, and now it'll be more because of the legislation that was just passed. The American Rescue Plan actually is going to put more money into these services. So we're hoping that the state can do the right thing again this year, put more money into the system so we can get that money out into the field and really make a difference in the lives of people.
Your story, all the work you've done is a great reflection of, advocates in general. So thank you for sharing all those points. If someone is out there right now watching and really wants to get in the position of being an advocate for whatever movement or social change that they want, what would your number one piece of advice be?
Well, decide what it is you want to support, and then look for the group that's helping support that cause. So, the ARCs are a tremendous organization still. They do a lot of good work. There's also the National Alliance for Direct Support Professionals that does a lot of great work. When you look at just, Google is your friend, because if you care about something and you put some search terms in, you're more than likely going to find a group that's supporting it. Get involved. I mean, even if it's writing letters, but there's a whole lot more you can do as an activist. You can advocate anytime. Like we talked about earlier, if if your trash isn't being picked up, you call your city council and you say, hey, look, your city council will help, get something taken care of. But when you become an activist, really what you're doing is you're committing to something and doing more intensive work. And so it could mean that you get to know your local representative, your local state senator. It could mean that you even get to know your U.S. representative or your U.S. senator if you care about something very deeply and you want to try to make a change in it. There are plenty of opportunities in the human service field to support causes that make a difference. And I mentioned earlier that I had a personal tragedy. There's a lot of work being done around mental health, trying to make sure that parity exists, trying to make sure that state laws specify that if you have a mental health condition or a substance use disorder, you're treated no differently than somebody who has a heart condition or a kidney problem or diabetes. That you should be able to get services and treatment for your mental health condition, your substance use disorder, just like you can from a physical ailment of any kind. And we passed some laws in Delaware along that line too. So to try to make sure parity existed, to try to make sure that people weren't having to jump through hoops to get treatment. So there's a whole lot you can do. It makes a difference, and I just encourage people to get involved if you really care about a particular cause.
Thomas, thank you so much for sharing everything you have today. I appreciate your time, and I appreciate the work that you've done. You sound like you persevered, and you've led a lot of people to do the same. So I appreciate you and everything you provided today, and I can't wait to talk soon.
Yeah, it's a great conversation, Casey. Thanks for inviting me to it.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of our Roundtable podcast. You can find episode 1 and 2 on our YouTube page. Just search NOHS Organization. And if you've got a topic you'd like to share, drop a comment below, or if you want to join the conversation, you can shoot me an email at meetingrep@nationalhumanservices.org. Be sure to connect with us on social media and head over to our website to check out all the ways you can get involved and stay up to date with everything NOHS.